betrayal, anger, and murder, a deadly cocktail that would shock even the quietest of small towns. That's how it all began in February of 2016 in the tiny, unsuspecting town of Alexis, North Carolina. The day started like any other in this close knit community, but it ended in horror, leaving three people dead and a family forever shattered. What could drive a seemingly ordinary woman, Crystal Gambino, to walk into her own home and, within moments, take the lives of her husband, Giovanni Gambino, and two others? The truth of what unfolded that day sent shockwaves through the town, leaving people asking the same question: how did this tragedy happen in a place like Alexis? This isn't just another crime story, it's a tale of love, betrayal, and violence where secrets turned deadly. What Crystal uncovered in her home that day would push her to the brink, setting off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. And while the crime itself was horrifying, the story behind it, the lies, the Craigslist ad, and the aftermath was even more disturbing. In this episode, we're diving deep into a case that shocked the nation and devastated a family. The Crystal Gambino case isn't just about murder. It's about what happens when trust is broken in the most devastating way possible. Buckle up because this story is as complex as it is tragic, and the truth, as you'll see, is far from simple. Crystal and Giovanni Gambino were not your typical couple. Beneath the surface of what may have seemed like a normal marriage in their North Carolina home, a storm had been brewing for years. Their relationship was riddled with tension, particularly around financial struggles and Giovanni's frequent infidelity. The cracks in their marriage were visible to those close to the family, but no one could have predicted the dark turn it would take. Giovanni, known to his friends as Gio, had a history of engaging in reckless behavior which only added to the couple's troubles. While Crystal tried to maintain a semblance of stability at home, their marriage was plagued by accusations of emotional abuse and financial instability. Giovanni's risky lifestyle, including his interactions on Craigslist to arrange extramarital affairs, strained their relationship to the breaking point. Friends and family would later describe their marriage as volatile, with deep rooted issues that both tried to hide from the outside world. Crystal had endured years of emotional torment, but many believed that she was reaching her limit as Giovanni's indiscretions became harder to ignore. As if the emotional strain wasn't enough, financial pressures weighed heavily on them. Giovanni, though charismatic, was often unemployed or involved in shady dealings, leaving Crystal to manage most of the household responsibilities. The combination of financial strain and infidelity made their home life increasingly toxic. It was a ticking time bomb, waiting for the slightest spark to ignite the catastrophe. That spark, as it turned out, was Giovanni's latest infidelity, the one that would not only expose his betrayal but drive Crystal to an unimaginable act of violence. In the weeks leading up to that fateful night, Giovanni Gambino set in motion a plan that would ultimately tear his life apart. Giovanni's marital issues with Crystal had reached new lows, and in what appeared to be yet another act of betrayal, he took to Craigslist in search of extramarital excitement. Without Crystal's knowledge, Giovanni posted an ad that would lure a couple, Jeffrey Gilliland and Stephanie Sanchez, to their home for a night of drug fueled sexual escapades. Giovanni's Craigslist ad was explicit, offering the couple a night of sexual activity in exchange for cocaine. Gilliland, an unemployed man looking for easy money and adventure, responded to the ad along with his girlfriend, Sanchez. The couple agreed to Giovanni's offer, not knowing how deadly this decision would turn out to be. It was clear that Giovanni had planned everything behind Crystal's back. On the day of the rendezvous, he invited the couple into his home, fully confident that his wife wouldn't walk in on their activities. But Giovanni's underestimation of Crystal's temper and timing would soon prove fatal for everyone involved. That evening, while Giovanni and the couple engaged in a sexual encounter in the bedroom, Crystal would come home, unaware of what was unfolding behind closed doors. The calm before the storm was brief, but it was enough to change the course of their lives forever. Giovanni's reckless decision to arrange this threesome set the stage for the horrific events that followed, and neither he nor his guests had any idea just how much danger they were in. Crystal's unexpected arrival and the gruesome aftermath would not only reveal the darkest parts of their broken marriage, but would also expose Giovanni's hidden life, one built on secrets, drugs, and betrayal. The moment Crystal Gambino walked into her home on that fateful evening, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet, but an unmistakable tension hung in the air. As she approached the bedroom, the horrifying truth began to unfold before her eyes. Her husband Giovanni, naked and entangled with Jeffrey Gilliland and Stephanie Sanchez in the throes of a sexual encounter. What she saw was more than just infidelity, it was a moment that shattered her reality. Years of marital strife, betrayal, and emotional turmoil culminated in this single discovery. Crystal's mind snapped. Overwhelmed by a mix of rage, hurt, and disbelief, she was no longer the woman she had been moments earlier. Crystal stormed out of the room, her heart pounding with a sense of betrayal so intense that it clouded all reason. With her hands trembling, she made her way to retrieve a .44 Magnum, a weapon that symbolized the violent turn her life was about to take. She returned to the bedroom where Giovanni and the couple, likely unaware of the depth of her anger, remained caught up in their activities.
Without hesitation, Crystal began firing. The gunshots ripped through the bedroom as she unleashed her fury on Giovanni, Gilliland, and Sanchez. Reloading the weapon multiple times, Crystal's rage seemed unstoppable. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Her world had already fallen apart, and this violent act was her way of regaining some semblance of control over the chaos.
By the time it was over, all three lay dead, and Crystal stood amidst the aftermath of her rage, her life forever changed by the devastation she had caused. The magnitude of what she had done wouldn't fully hit her until later, but in that instant, her focus was on one thing: the betrayal that led to this horrific crime. In the chaos that followed Crystal's shocking discovery of her husband in bed with Jeffrey Gilliland and Stephanie Sanchez, her world collapsed into violence. Crystal's immediate reaction was not just emotional, it was explosive. After storming out of the room, Crystal grabbed her husband's .44 Magnum, a gun capable of delivering deadly force with each pull of the trigger. Crystal returned to the bedroom, where the three remained completely unaware of the danger looming. In that split second, she transformed from a scorned wife to a killer. Fueled by a mix of betrayal, anger, and years of suppressed resentment, she fired the gun at the group, the sound of the shots echoing through the house. Giovanni, her husband, was her first target, the man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way. She aimed the gun and fired, unloading multiple rounds into him, making sure the man she once loved wouldn't survive. But Crystal wasn't finished. Her anger extended to Gilliland and Sanchez, the couple who, in her eyes, were complicit in this unforgivable act. She continued shooting, emptying the magnum's chamber. The force of her emotions was so overwhelming that she reloaded the gun, not once, but twice, to ensure that her rage found its mark on all three. In total, she fired approximately 15 rounds. The bedroom quickly became a scene of unimaginable carnage, the aftermath of Crystal's fury staining every surface. Giovanni and the couple lay lifeless on the floor, their bodies riddled with bullets. There was no sign of hesitation in Crystal's actions. Her movements were deliberate and focused, as if each shot was a release of years of pent-up frustration and hurt. Amidst the bloodshed, Crystal's mind must have been a whirlwind of emotions. The gravity of her actions hadn't fully hit her yet. The sound of gunfire and the image of the three bodies on the floor were the immediate consequences of her blind rage, but the emotional and legal consequences of her act were still to come. Crystal's life in that moment had changed forever, leaving her standing in the aftermath of the violence she had unleashed. In the immediate aftermath of the brutal killings, Crystal Gambino made a hasty, almost half-hearted attempt to cover up what she had done. The reality of her actions hadn't fully sunk in yet, but she knew enough to try to erase some of the evidence. Crystal's first instinct was to clean up the mess she had just created, so she placed some of the bloodied bedding into the washing machine, as if cleaning up the surface could somehow erase the horror that had unfolded inside her home. But her attempts at concealing the crime didn't stop there. Next, Crystal decided to dispose of one of the bodies. She took Stephanie Sanchez, the woman who had been a part of the fateful threesome, and dragged her lifeless body out into the yard. Using a wheelbarrow, she moved Sanchez's body to a spot where she had planned to burn it. Crystal piled debris on top of the body, perhaps in an attempt to prepare for a fire that would destroy the evidence. It was a crude and desperate act, revealing a woman whose grip on reality was slipping. However, even this effort to hide what she had done wasn't fully realized. As Crystal was in the process of trying to cover up the crime, she was reminded of a more mundane responsibility, picking up her 8-year-old daughter from school. The murder scene was left behind, with two bodies still lying inside the bedroom and Stephanie's body abandoned in the yard. Crystal dropped everything and drove to pick up her child, leaving the horrific aftermath of her rage untouched. This attempt to cover up the crime was a fleeting one, perhaps more symbolic of her state of mind at that moment than a serious effort to escape the consequences. It was as though the gravity of her actions hadn't quite settled in yet, and for a brief moment, Crystal believed she could somehow go back to her normal routine. But the truth was undeniable. The bodies, the blood, and the sheer devastation she left in her wake were far beyond anything a simple cleanup could fix. After the horrific events at her home, Crystal Gambino faced a brief moment of clarity amidst the chaos. Instead of continuing her feeble attempt to cover up the murders, she made the decision to leave her home and drive directly to her brother-in-law's house. This choice seemed to indicate that, deep down, Crystal knew the enormity of what she had done could not be hidden. She arrived at her brother-in-law's house in a state of shock, her emotions swinging between fear, guilt, and confusion. Once there, Crystal made a chilling confession. She admitted that she had just killed her husband, Giovanni Gambino, and the two others, Jeffrey Gilliland and Stephanie Sanchez. The weight of the confession, especially coming from someone so close, left her brother-in-law stunned. It was not the kind of news anyone could easily process, particularly given the brutal nature of the murders. Unable to believe what he was hearing, Crystal's brother-in-law immediately alerted authorities. He placed a call to the police, relaying what Crystal had told him, though likely still struggling to grasp the gravity of the situation. The authorities, already somewhat familiar with the couple's troubled marriage, wasted no time in responding. When police arrived, Crystal did not resist. It was as if the act of confessing had drained her of any energy or defiance. She calmly surrendered herself, fully aware that the lives she had taken and her own were irreversibly shattered. Crystal's decision to confess to a family member rather than fleeing or further hiding the crime may have reflected a subconscious desire for punishment or an understanding that what she had done was beyond repair. Her brother-in-law's reaction, one of shock and disbelief, was echoed by the wider family, many of whom could not reconcile the Crystal they knew with the cold-blooded killer she had just become. The 911 call placed by Crystal Gambino's brother-in-law was a turning point in the investigation, as it provided authorities with the crucial information they needed to act quickly. He conveyed the chilling confession that Crystal had just made. She had killed her husband, Giovanni, and two others inside their home. His voice, filled with both shock and disbelief, reflected the overwhelming gravity of the situation. During the call, he explained how Crystal had shown up at his house, detailing the gruesome events that had transpired. Although he was clearly shaken, he remained focused enough to provide the dispatcher with key details about the location of the bodies and the nature of the crime. The dispatcher kept him calm, gathering as much information as possible to assist the police in their response. This call set the wheels in motion for law enforcement, who were dispatched immediately to the Gambino residence. Upon arriving, officers entered the home and discovered the brutal crime scene. Giovanni, Jeffrey Gilliland, and Stephanie Sanchez were found dead in the bedroom, their bodies bearing the marks of Crystal's rage. The scene was as horrific as her brother in law had described, confirming every word of the confession he had relayed. The 911 call was not only critical in alerting authorities, but also in establishing the timeline and details of the crime. It became a key piece of evidence in understanding how the events unfolded and Crystal's state of mind at the time of the murders. When police arrived at the Gambino residence following the 911 call, they were met with a grisly and chaotic crime scene. As they entered the house, it quickly became apparent that this was no ordinary domestic disturbance. Inside the bedroom, they found the lifeless bodies of Giovanni Gambino, Jeffrey Gilliland, and Stephanie Sanchez. All three victims were discovered naked, a key detail that underscored the nature of the event. Crystal had interrupted a sexual encounter between her husband and the couple. The scene itself was marked by a shocking amount of violence. Giovanni and the couple had been shot multiple times, their bodies showing the full force of Crystal's rage. Bullet casings were scattered across the room, and blood covered the bed and floor. The methodical nature of the crime. Crystal had reloaded the gun multiple times was evident in the positioning of the victims and the number of shots fired. Each of the victims bore the marks of her relentless anger. As investigators pieced together the details, the story unfolded quickly. Crystal's confession, relayed by her brother in law during the 911 call, provided a clear narrative. She had caught her husband in the act of betrayal and, in a fit of rage, killed all three individuals. Given the state of the bodies and the way the crime had unfolded, detectives were able to determine the motive almost immediately. This was a crime of passion. The investigation also revealed that Giovanni had arranged the encounter through Craigslist, offering the couple cocaine in exchange for their participation. This added another layer of complexity to the case, but the primary motive, Crystal's explosive response to her husband's infidelity, was clear. There was no mystery about who had committed the crime or why. The brutal nature of the killings and the fact that Crystal had confessed meant the investigation moved swiftly. The police collected the evidence they needed: the gun, the bullet casings, and testimony from Crystal herself, all of which painted a chilling picture of how an ordinary evening had turned into a triple homicide. The discovery of the naked bodies, alongside the details of the Craigslist arrangement, confirmed the motive: Crystal's uncontrollable fury after walking in on her husband's ultimate betrayal. The Crystal Gambino case sent shockwaves through the small town of Alexis, North Carolina, a quiet community unaccustomed to the kind of brutal violence that had unfolded in their midst. Word of the murders spread rapidly, and soon the local community was gripped by both fear and disbelief. Many residents couldn't reconcile the idea of such a horrific crime occurring in their backyard, especially involving a family they had known for years. Crystal and Giovanni weren't strangers to their neighbors, and the personal nature of the crime made it all the more unsettling. As the details of the crime emerged, particularly the bizarre circumstances of a threesome arranged through Craigslist and the violent aftermath, the public reaction grew even more intense. This wasn't just a domestic dispute turned deadly. It was a story that involved betrayal, drugs, and sexual intrigue, elements that fueled public fascination and media coverage. What could drive a wife to such an extreme act of violence? This question echoed in conversations throughout the community and beyond. Local news outlets were quick to pick up on the case, but it wasn't long before national media began to cover it as well. The sensational nature of the murders, combined with the shocking details of Giovanni's Craigslist ad, the cocaine exchange, and Crystal's violent response, captured the attention of a much wider audience. The story became a fixture in true crime discussions, and programs like Deadly Women would later examine the case in detail. For the community of Alexis, the murders were more than just a headline. They represented a loss of innocence and a reminder that even in the most peaceful of towns, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. Many residents expressed a mixture of sorrow and disbelief, struggling to come to terms with the fact that a family they had once known was at the center of such a tragic and violent event. The public interest wasn't just driven by the violence, it was the surreal blend of betrayal, sexual intrigue, and Crystal's shocking actions that kept people talking. The case quickly became a symbol of how even the most ordinary lives can unravel in extraordinary and devastating ways. Following her chilling confession to the murders of her husband Giovanni Gambino and the two other victims, Jeffrey Gilliland and Stephanie Sanchez, Crystal Gambino was swiftly taken into custody by authorities. She did not resist arrest and, in fact, appeared almost resigned to her fate, having already confessed the crime to her brother in law and through the subsequent 911 call. Once in custody, Crystal was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, an indication that prosecutors believed the killings were premeditated and intentional. The evidence collected against her was damning and left little room for doubt. The crime scene itself told much of the story: 3 naked bodies shot multiple times, and the physical evidence linking the killings directly to Crystal. The gun she used, a .44 Magnum, was recovered from the scene along with spent shell casings, all meticulously documenting the violence she had unleashed that day. Additionally, there was the incriminating confession she had given to her brother in law, followed by the details relayed to law enforcement through the 911 call. Beyond these direct admissions, investigators had further evidence to support their charges. Crystal had made a half-hearted attempt to clean up the crime scene, including placing bedding in the washing machine, which only further implicated her in the aftermath of the murders. Prosecutors moved quickly to build their case, relying heavily on Crystal's own actions and words. The combination of her confession, the physical evidence from the scene, and the detailed account of how the crime unfolded left little room for a defense. Crystal Gambino's arrest marked the beginning of a legal process that would see her charged with one of the most heinous crimes in the town's history. The 3 counts of first-degree murder reflected the severity of her actions, each charge carrying the possibility of life in prison or even the death penalty. From the outset, it was clear that Crystal's legal team would have a difficult task ahead of them, as the overwhelming evidence, combined with her own admissions, made the case seem like an open and shut prosecution. As the court proceedings began, Crystal Gambino's legal team faced an uphill battle. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Her confession, the physical evidence, and the brutal nature of the crime left little room for doubt. However, the defense mounted an argument centered on Crystal's mental state, aiming to prove that she acted out of diminished capacity due to emotional distress and long-standing mental health issues. From the outset, the defense painted a picture of a woman who had been pushed to the brink by years of emotional turmoil, infidelity, and an unstable marriage. They argued that when Crystal walked in on her husband and the couple in the midst of a sexual encounter, it triggered an uncontrollable emotional response, a psychological break fueled by years of pent-up resentment, betrayal, and untreated mental health problems. Her attorneys emphasized that this wasn't the cold, calculated act of a premeditated killer, but rather the explosive response of someone pushed past their emotional limits. They introduced evidence that Crystal had suffered from mental health struggles leading up to the murders, citing possible untreated depression and emotional instability. The defense hoped to reduce her charges by portraying her actions as those of a person in a state of extreme emotional disturbance rather than premeditated intent. They sought to convince the court that Crystal's capacity to think rationally at the time of the murders had been severely impaired, thus weakening the case for first-degree murder. However, the prosecution countered these arguments by pointing to the methodical nature of the crime. Crystal's deliberate act of retrieving the gun, reloading it multiple times, and shooting all 3 victims. They argued that while Crystal may have been emotionally distressed, her actions showed intent and control, pointing to a clear case of premeditated murder. Moreover, her attempts to clean the crime scene, although brief and poorly executed, indicated a consciousness of guilt. The early stages of the trial saw both sides arguing over Crystal's mental state, with the defense pushing for a lesser charge, such as second-degree murder, based on emotional distress. Ultimately, the court was tasked with deciding whether Crystal had been acting with full intent or if her emotional state mitigated the severity of her crime. As Crystal Gambino's case progressed, the overwhelming evidence and her own confession made it clear that a full trial could end with severe consequences, potentially a life sentence or the death penalty. However, before the trial could reach that stage, Crystal and her legal team struck a plea deal with prosecutors in a strategic move that avoided the uncertainties of a jury trial. In March of 2017, Crystal pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter. This plea deal significantly reduced her sentencing potential, allowing her to avoid a first-degree murder conviction, which carried harsher penalties. Instead, the deal resulted in a sentence of 29 years in prison. Prosecutors likely allowed the deal for several reasons. First, Crystal had already confessed to the murders, so her guilt was not in question. However, a trial could have been lengthy and emotionally taxing for the victims' families, who would have had to endure graphic details and relive the traumatic events. By accepting the plea, the state ensured a guaranteed conviction and a substantial prison sentence without the uncertainty that can accompany a jury's decision, especially in cases involving potential emotional distress defenses. Additionally, by agreeing to the plea deal, Crystal's defense team mitigated the risk of an even harsher sentence. Her legal team had presented evidence of her diminished capacity and emotional instability, which might have influenced the jury's verdict had the case gone to trial. In turn, the plea provided closure for both the prosecution and the victims' families, albeit without the satisfaction of a life sentence. Ultimately, while some believed that the 29-year sentence was too lenient for the brutal triple homicide, the plea deal represented a compromise that ensured Crystal faced serious consequences without the unpredictable risks of a full trial. In March 2017, the court officially sentenced Crystal Gambino to 29 years in prison following her guilty plea to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter. This sentencing marked the conclusion of a case that had deeply shocked the local community and the families of the victims. The plea deal allowed Crystal to avoid a first-degree murder conviction and its potential life sentence, but the sentence of 29 years was not enough for the grieving families. During the sentencing, several family members of the victims voiced their anger and frustration, believing that Crystal's punishment was too lenient given the brutal nature of the crime. Eddie Heim, the father of Stephanie Sanchez, expressed his pain and disbelief, stating that 29 years was not enough for the loss of his daughter's life. He felt that nothing could ever compensate for the devastation his family had endured. Similarly, Jennifer Burke, Jeffrey Gilliland's sister, shared photographs of her brother during the sentencing, hoping to remind Crystal of the lives she had taken. She openly expressed her desire for Crystal to suffer every day, haunted by the weight of what she had done. For the victims' families, no sentence could bring back their loved ones, but the relatively short prison term felt like an injustice compared to the magnitude of the crime. Though the court had followed through on the terms of the plea deal, many outside the courtroom echoed the family's sentiments, arguing that Crystal's sentence did not fully reflect the gravity of the triple homicide. Despite the leniency of the sentence, Crystal Gambino would spend nearly 3 decades behind bars, but for the families of the victims, it would never feel like enough. The emotional toll of the murders on the victims' families was immeasurable, and the courtroom during Crystal Gambino's sentencing echoed with their grief. The families of Jeffrey Gilliland and Stephanie Sanchez, in particular, felt that Crystal's 29-year sentence was nowhere near sufficient for the loss of their loved ones. Eddie Heim, Stephanie's father, spoke with heartbreak about how the sentence would never fill the void left by his daughter's death. He believed no amount of time behind bars could balance the weight of his loss. Similarly, Jennifer Burke, Jeffrey Gilliland's sister, gave an emotional testimony reminding Crystal of the lives she had destroyed. She spoke of sleepless nights and unrelenting grief, wishing that Crystal would experience the same suffering every day of her life. These families were left with more than just anger, they were left grappling with the idea that Crystal would someday walk free while their loved ones were gone forever. This unshakable grief would continue long after the legal proceedings ended, a dark shadow that the families would carry for the rest of their lives. Crystal Gambino's motives were rooted in a deep well of emotional turmoil, long-standing marital discord, and personal betrayal. Her marriage to Giovanni had been fraught with problems for years, including infidelity, financial strain, and emotional abuse. Crystal, who had seemingly reached a breaking point, snapped after discovering her husband engaged in a sexual encounter with two strangers in her own home. The discovery not only shattered her emotionally, but also triggered a violent reaction born of years of repressed hurt and frustration. Crystal's actions were not premeditated in the sense of planning to murder her husband and the couple, but her retrieval of the gun, reloading it, and shooting all three multiple times points to a sudden, intense eruption of rage. This rage, likely fueled by Giovanni's betrayal and the realization of her broken marriage, became her driving motive in that fatal moment. Emotional instability, marital betrayal, and her desire for control over the chaos of her life culminated in this tragic and violent outcome. The defense team presented the case that years of emotional and possibly physical abuse had worn Crystal down, leaving her emotionally fragile and mentally unstable. They argued that domestic violence, largely emotional in nature, played a significant role in the deterioration of her marriage to Giovanni. Although not widely discussed before the murders, testimony during the trial hinted at years of conflict and strain, with Giovanni's infidelities deepening the cracks in their relationship. Crystal's legal team also pointed to her husband's reckless behavior, including his involvement with drugs and dangerous Craigslist encounters, as contributing factors. Her defense painted a picture of a woman whose mental health had deteriorated after years of being subjected to toxic dynamics in her marriage, pushing her to the brink when she finally discovered Giovanni's betrayal firsthand. The Crystal Gambino case quickly became a media sensation, fueled by the salacious details surrounding the crime. Local news outlets were the first to cover the shocking murders, but it wasn't long before national media picked up on the story. The fact that the murders involved a threesome arranged via Craigslist, cocaine, and a wife walking in on the encounter made it a tabloid worthy narrative. Public perception of Crystal Gambino was mixed. Some viewed her as a victim of a toxic relationship who snapped under immense emotional pressure. Others saw her as a cold-blooded murderer who methodically executed three people in a moment of rage. Programs like Deadly Women covered the case, adding to the intrigue surrounding Crystal's story and painting her as a deeply disturbed individual whose actions stemmed from personal devastation. Legal experts weighed in on Crystal's plea deal, which sparked debate about whether justice had been fully served. Some legal analysts pointed out that the plea deal allowed the prosecution to secure a guaranteed conviction while avoiding the risk of an unpredictable jury trial, which could have gone either way, especially given the defense's argument of emotional instability. From a legal standpoint, the plea deal made sense, as it guaranteed significant prison time without the uncertainties that accompany cases involving complex emotional and psychological defenses. However, critics argued that the 29-year sentence did not fully reflect the brutal nature of the crime. Legal experts discussed how this case fit into broader trends involving emotional distress defenses, which have often swayed juries or led to reduced charges in high-profile cases. In Crystal's case, the plea deal allowed her to avoid a first-degree murder conviction, raising questions about whether her emotional state should have mitigated her responsibility for the deaths. The Crystal Gambino case serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences that can arise from unchecked emotions, betrayal, and violence. It highlights how deeply personal conflicts, especially those fueled by infidelity, emotional instability, and toxic relationships, can spiral into unimaginable tragedy. Crystal's story is one of a woman who, after years of emotional abuse and marital breakdown, reached a point of no return. For those involved, the impact of this crime will be felt for years to come. The victims' families are left with a deep, unresolved grief, while Crystal faces the long term consequences of her violent actions. This case underscores the importance of addressing domestic issues and mental health concerns before they escalate to a point where lives are irrevocably destroyed. In the end, the lesson is clear: the cost of impulsive violence is far too high, and the scars it leaves on all involved are everlasting. As we close this chapter, I want to leave you with one question. How far would you go if the foundation of your life was shattered in an instant? Crystal Gambino's story isn't just about murder, it's about the consequences of unchecked emotions, of bottled up pain that finally erupts in a devastating way. It's a reminder that darkness can exist even in the most ordinary lives, and if left unresolved, it can spiral into tragedy. This case should make us think deeply about the cracks we may overlook in our own lives. What festers in silence, unnoticed, until it becomes too late to fix? We all have moments where we feel betrayed, where we think we've been wronged. But what separates those who move forward from those who fall apart is often the smallest of choices to seek help, to communicate, to confront our problems before they explode. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and join our community where we dive deep into these powerful stories that remind us of the human capacity for both love and destruction. Share your thoughts below and let's continue the conversation about the lessons we can take from tragedies like this one. Remember, the more we talk, the more we learn, and the more we can prevent history from repeating itself. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and always remember that even in the darkest moments, we have a choice.